They passed through the palace gates quietly, almost without being noticed. They did not wear jewels, nor carry the authority of a title, yet they held something far greater, influence over the minds of those born to rule an empire. For centuries in Britain, a peculiar class of women lived within royal walls, entrusted with a task so powerful that monarchs both depended on them and feared them. They were governesses to royal children, the unseen architects of kings and queens. Imagine the echo of small footsteps in the corridors of St. James's Palace, the subdued voices of tutors, the rustle of silk dresses too formal for childhood. Somewhere behind heavy doors, a governess watches a young prince copy letters on parchment, guiding his hand gently, but always at a measured distance. She is not a servant, nor a noblewoman. She exists in the narrowest space between classes, shaping the future yet belonging to none of it. In the 18th and 19th centuries, the British royal household relied on these women with astonishing intensity. A governess was expected to provide education, discipline, moral guidance, and emotional restraint, yet she could not become close, could not show affection freely, and could never forget that her existence depended on silence. Even her salary was deliberately modest, ensuring she would never feel equal to those she taught. Records from Windsor Castle show that a governess' daily routine began before dawn. Lessons were arranged in strict segments: penmanship, French grammar, Bible study, etiquette, history, and geography. A future monarch's handwriting might be corrected dozens of times in a single hour, even if tears blurred the ink. Patience was expected. Warmth was not. But behind these rigid expectations lies something more curious. Several diaries preserved in royal archives hint at a subtle truth: the governess often understood a young prince or princess more deeply than their own parents. The queen could not sit for hours by a child's side, the king rarely entered the schoolroom at all. Household staff moved in strict hierarchies. Only the governess remained in the child's presence long enough to witness every temper, every fear, every emerging belief. This strange closeness turned the governess into an invisible threat. If she impressed her values too strongly, she might steer the future of the crown, as one 1824 memorandum warned. Yet if she failed to inspire discipline and restraint, she could be dismissed overnight, her reputation questioned, and her career ruined. She carried influence without authority, responsibility without protection. Still, many accepted this life willingly. Some saw it as a calling, others saw it as the only path available to educated women who refused to settle for marriage arranged by their families. And so, behind the ornate walls of Buckingham Palace, Kensington, and Balmoral, an entire lineage of governesses shaped British monarchs quietly, carefully, and almost anonymously. They were rarely mentioned in royal proclamations, yet they moved in silence through private corridors, where the future of the monarchy slept behind carved doors. Some were chosen from well-educated families, others from modest households where loyalty mattered more than lineage. But all were subjected to an examination more invasive than any court appointment. Their background was dissected, their letters read, their beliefs inspected line by line. A governess could not merely teach, she had to embody restraint, secrecy, and emotional discipline. The palace trusted her not because she was kind, but because she could endure solitude without speaking. Surrounded by wealth they did not share, they lived in the shadow of glittering halls. Their bedrooms were often modest, tucked near the children's quarters, positioned so that a governess was never far away. Yet she was also never fully a part of the family she served. She dined separately, walked separately, and even read books separate from the court's leisure. Many governesses wrote of feeling invisible, present, but never there, as one described in a private letter dated 1821. The queen might nod to her in passing, but only the children truly looked into her eyes. The work demanded more than education, it demanded psychological vigilance. A careless word about politics, a hint of improper affection toward a student, even reading the wrong book could end a career. A governess was expected to shape the mind of a future ruler without influencing their opinions too strongly. She had to teach them empathy without steering them toward rebellion, discipline without coldness, morality without moralizing too harshly. In a strange way, the crown wanted a teacher who left no fingerprints on the mind she molded. Yet history remembers a few who could not help but leave a mark. One governess, Mary Ann Scarrett, served in the household of Queen Victoria's children and became, over time, an unspoken advisor. Although she was hired originally as a companion and manager of personal affairs, her proximity to the young royals granted her a quiet influence that no title could reflect. Letters describe the trust placed in her, and even after her retirement, Victoria continued to write to her. This subtle connection revealed how blurry the boundary could become. A governess was to remain distant, yet she was closest to the future monarch's heart. Others were noted only when they overstepped. A governess who shared political pamphlets, one who secretly encouraged musical ambitions considered unbecoming of a prince, another who developed too strong an emotional bond, all were quietly dismissed and erased from records. Their names still exist, but only in fragments scattered through archives like ghosts retreating behind parchment. No scandal was announced. No accusation was printed. The palace preferred omissions over explanations, silence over defense. The children themselves often remembered their governesses long after they became adults. Some wrote about them as protectors, others remembered discipline and constant watchfulness. The royal nursery created a paradox. It was at once the safest and the most surveilled place in the kingdom. A child learned early that trust had rules, affection had borders, and even friendship could be monitored. Below the polished surface of royal etiquette, the governess lived in a world of strict hierarchies. She was neither servant nor noble, and this made her both visible and invisible. She dined alone, rarely joined by other staff, yet she was trusted to shape the minds and manners of future kings and queens. Letters from the 1820s describe this existence as lonely but exalted, a role that granted access but not belonging. She slept in a modest room close to the nursery so she could be summoned at any hour, and sometimes she remained awake long after the palace quieted, making notes by candlelight about lessons, tempers, and small signs of character that might determine the future of a dynasty. Many of these governesses had been educated beyond their social rank. Some spoke several languages, had studied geography, mathematics, literature, and religion far more deeply than the nobles they served. Yet they rarely received recognition. They were hired to cultivate intelligence but were never permitted to display their own. In Kensington Palace, a governess once noted that she knew Latin better than the prince, but such knowledge was, to be used, not shown. Her handwriting in surviving journals reveals discipline, sharp observation, and a mind trained to remain silent. It was silence, in fact, that was one of the unwritten rules of the profession. A governess could never speak publicly about royal children. She could not discuss their weaknesses, illnesses, fears, or private tendencies. She was expected to protect the reputation of the crown as carefully as she protected the child's first letters and books. Some documents surviving in the royal archives even include signed pledges promising lifelong discretion. Breaking them meant exile from court society and, in some cases, the destruction of future employment. Despite the secrecy, tiny fragments of their voices survived. In 1839, a governess who taught in Clarence House wrote of a young princess who did not sleep well unless promised that the moon watched her. Another wrote, with quiet admiration, that a future king had a stubborn will but an honest gaze. These notes were not meant for the public. They were personal attempts to understand children destined to live under the weight of crowns long before they could lift one. Yet there was another part of a governess' duty that few realized. She protected not only minds but hearts. Royal children were often surrounded by politics from birth, their friendships observed, their tempers judged, their preferences discussed as matters of state. A governess became their shield. She was often the first to comfort them when they were scolded for tears, or to teach them how to hide emotions that might later be used against them by court gossip or political factions. She taught them the art of composure, not as a lesson of manners, but as survival. There was one more task, rarely acknowledged. When disputes arose between royal parents and their children, the governess stood between them. She observed without taking sides, guiding the child through confusion and the parent through expectation. And sometimes, she became the quiet witness to family tensions that would shape the monarchy for generations. Diaries from Windsor mention arguments whispered through closed doors, where the governess heard every word but was trusted to speak none. Only decades later would historians recognize that these women did something extraordinary: they carried the future of the monarchy without ever being allowed to step into the light of its power. Their invisible labor formed the voices, manners, and values of rulers Britain still remembers. In the royal nurseries of Britain, the figure of the governess was both indispensable and invisible. She shaped the manners of future monarchs, taught them languages, history, etiquette, and self-restraint, yet she was never permitted to belong to their world. Letters from the early 19th century describe a curious life in between. She dined neither with the servants nor with the family, eaten alone in her quarters or at a small side table just out of sight. This quiet isolation became a pattern, a ritual of boundaries. To teach a prince or princess meant to exist close enough to form their mind, but far enough to never form their heart. One of the most compelling examples comes from the household of Queen Victoria. Before her reign, young Victoria was observed by Baroness Louise Lezen, a German governess whose presence left an imprint deeper than most courtiers dared to admit. Lezen taught the future queen discipline and independence, instilled a strict moral structure, and guarded her against manipulation within the palace. Many believe that without Lezen's unyielding influence, Victoria would have grown into a compliant figure, easily bent by aristocratic pressure. Instead, she emerged decisive, self-assured, and stubborn enough to resist political puppeteering. Yet, Lezen's power was not welcomed by everyone. When Prince Albert entered the royal household, he sensed the invisible authority the governess held over Victoria and feared that his role as husband would always be secondary to hers. Tension grew sharply, documented in private letters and diary entries. Albert accused Lezen of encouraging Victoria's independence to the point of resisting his leadership. Lezen, in turn, believed Albert tried to isolate the Queen emotionally. The conflict was quiet but transformative. Eventually, Lezen was sent away, her absence leaving a strangely hollow echo in the royal nursery. Victoria wept, but never brought her back. Other governesses never held such power, but their stories still trace the same uneasy divide. Some served royal children who would never remember their names. Others were dismissed without compensation after years of loyalty, because affection was a forbidden currency. A letter from a governess in the household of George III reveals that she was instructed to teach tenderness, but to show none. Another noted that she must prepare their feelings for a nation, not for a woman. The emotional paradox was profound: they shaped the hearts of those who were never allowed to love them in return. Hidden in journals and housekeeping budgets are clues to their uniqueness. Governesses were expected to be educated beyond the level of ordinary servants, yet paid less than lower-ranking tutors. They were trusted with the minds of heirs, yet always positioned on the edge of privilege. Their handwriting filled notebooks that monarchs once used, yet their own names were written in fading ink. Their legacy lived in rulers, not in history books. The more closely historians examine the written trails left behind by royal households, the more the position of a governess reveals itself not as a quiet background role, but as a subtle instrument of shaping the monarchy. Many royal children adored their governesses with the fierce loyalty that can only exist between a child and the one adult who sees them privately, without protocol. Yet that same closeness could become dangerous. A misplaced phrase, a hint of political sympathy, the wrong story told before bedtime, even education had consequences inside the palace. One of the most revealing examples comes from the late 19th century. Lady Susan Sibbald, governess to young aristocrats close to the royal family, wrote in her diary that governesses were expected to educate loyally without imparting too much opinion. She described moments when she had to stop herself from answering questions honestly. A princess, she wrote, must be taught to think, yet not think too freely. Her notes were never meant for public eyes, but they capture the quiet pressure that defined this profession, to form minds without leaving fingerprints. some governesses paid a heavy price for stepping outside invisible boundaries. In 1825, a respected tutor was quietly dismissed from a noble household for introducing controversial literature into lessons. Nothing harmful, nothing extreme, only the wrong ideas at the wrong time. The scandal never reached the public, it was sealed behind closed doors, as most governess stories were. The outside world kept imagining mild women with sewing baskets and soft voices, while real stories remained protected by discretion and secrecy. And yet, if one looks closely, the legacy of governesses still lingers. In handwriting that shaped royal letters, in the languages future monarchs spoke fluently, in polite restraint that followed them to diplomatic negotiations. It persists in the subtle habits of rulers who learned early that someone always watched, always listened, always expected grace. The governess was not simply an educator, she was the quiet architect of behavior. Her work lived on in the public image of the crown. Perhaps that is why their names rarely appear in monuments or official histories. Their accomplishments were never meant to shine on their own. They were designed to shine through someone else. Behind portraits of royal children, behind flawless speeches and graceful manners, there is almost always an invisible governess, shaping the future with a voice as soft as the turning of a page. And history rarely remembers those who were required to remain unseen. If this glimpse into the hidden world of royal upbringing has intrigued you, share your thoughts. The past becomes clearer when curious minds meet it halfway. And if you wish to continue exploring the silent corners of history, consider subscribing to Old Britain Secrets. There are many more stories waiting, just beyond the edge of what was ever meant to be written down.